which feels great. And I'm very happy and privileged to be here. So I have way too many slides, and I have a lot to say today. So let's light this candle. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Rodolphe, and I want to tell you first and foremost why I'm here today talking about this topic. I'm here today because 6.5 years ago, in 2014, I received an email saying, Rodolphe, we'd like to offer you a job, and we'll pay you $88,000 per year. This is based on the salary formula. This was a very, very specific number. And there was a specific number because I was working at Buffer. And when I entered Buffer, I was immediately amazed. Some of you may know this company as a very transparent company that likes to share a lot of what they do. They share it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So when I stepped into the company, before even applying to the job as an applicant, I knew how much I would be making thanks to the salary formula. And as luck will have it, for the next 3 to 4 years, I became the director of operation and finance, handling the salary formula myself. So I became crazy interested in seeing how it works and understanding how other teams are doing this as well. So this is why we're here to talk about global compensation framework. As explained before, I run a website called remotive.io. We help startup hire remote workers. We've been around for 6 years, and we work with a variety of companies from P9 family. Hit me up on Slack at any point. I know that the topic we're addressing is a big one, so I'm here to give you an introduction and to give you pointers as to how other companies are doing it and not to solve the entire question altogether, okay? A little disclosure here, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a CPA, I'm just someone who's been hanging out and contracted and be doing a lot of compensation framework over the years, and that's what I want to chat about today. If you have questions, and if we short on time for any reason, you can hit me up at the networking event happening later on today, whatever time that is for you, or in the P9 Slack channel, #remote, or directly via DMs. I'm there a lot. Okay, so let's chat about typical compensation policy. What do we usually mean by compensation policy? For most companies, compensation policy is saying we offer competitive pay on job descriptions, when in reality, it's not really explicit, and either as an employee inside the company or as an applicant outside the company, you don't really know what you're going to get offered. And truth being that when employees are asking, companies sort of weasel their way out of it and say, well, it's complicated. We don't really have a framework. We may have experience level, but when it comes to compensation, it's complicated. And what that actually means is that compensation oftentimes, especially for senior people, is negotiated. Nothing is wrong with that model. I'm just sharing what the typical mindset and framework of company doing compensation policy is today. When it comes to distributed compensation policy, so now we're not talking only about companies, but distributed one as well. It's interesting because you see companies doing a variety of different things, which we're going to detail in this session. Some companies are paying people ad hoc and just enjoy arbitrage. Some people are based in San Francisco and employ people in a local rate, Bangladesh, for instance. And they enjoy the difference. If you remember the crazy outsourcing and offshoring phase in the 90s and way before, it has always been happening. Besides, perks and equity are very often opaque and can vary dramatically. But what I mean by that is that if you have a US entity, for instance, you may be offering 401k as a retirement vehicle. But if you don't match that in, say, France, Belgium, and Germany, well, chances are you're not really offering the same compensation as a package to everyone, because again, compensation is your pay, your equity, your perks, and all the rest. So it's a global package you get out of your employment. And the last thing that's pretty typical when you talk about compensation policy is that big tech, and especially Fortune 500, they absolutely love location-based pay. I myself worked for Fortune 500 in Shanghai, in London, in Dublin, and in Munich. And every time in each company, there was a grid line saying which level are you and what location are you working from. It's always been like that. I worked at Google, the Dublin office, London office, the Berlin office, and the San Francisco office, Mountain View in particular, had dramatically different compensation. Why? Because a lot of companies believe that there's an arbitrage that's going on, and they want to pay the local market. So big tech, Fortune 500, they love paying you based on your location. That's always been going on, at least ever since I could look it up. Now, What typical compensation policy are we seeing for distributed teams? I've seen 4 different flavors that I'd like to share with you today. The first is San Francisco salaries from everyone, which is Basecamp policy. Then we're going to look at formula-led salaries, which I did myself at Buffer, other companies as well. Then we talk about geo-arbitrage and notable exceptions. Please note that every single company you're going to encounter has a different one. I'm not here to point one and saying this is what you should do. This is a very complex topic. I'm going to point the controversies and the tricky part. And then if you want to have an individual discussion, again, hit me up in person, or let's have a group conversation at some point through this or later. And before doing this talk, meaning yesterday around about lunchtime, Paris time, where I live, I asked a question on social network. I asked it on LinkedIn and on Twitter. The question was, remote companies using locally adjusted pay. Is this fair or is this unfair? I had a lot of answers on Twitter. I had a lot of answers on LinkedIn. And guess what? The way I worded this question was deliberate. I said, how do you feel about this in essence? Is this fair or unfair? So you use the concept of fairness. And if you use the concept of fairness, a lot of people are going to say, no, it's not normal that I live in Paris and I get paid less than this person doing the same job in San Francisco. We all feel differently about this topic around the world. Some people feel strongly about it, others not so much. Truth of the matter is, and the reason I bring this up, is that compensation is a feeling-based conversation. It's about how you feel. It's not just a number you stick on the door and say, that's what it is. When you give a compensation to an employee, they're going to share it with other employee, and the word is going to get out. So conversation and decision you make on your compensation framework are linked to your culture and are linked to how people relate to one another within the company. So let's check this out. Compensation triggers an emotional reaction always. First, because outsourcing and offshoring had a pretty bad rep from the years before, and a lot of people have often been scared to lose their job for someone who's way cheaper as an employee in another country. Also, back when I was working at Buffer, I've been in conversation where, due to the compensation framework, if someone moved from an expensive city to a less expensive city, we had to decrease the salary. And let me tell you one thing. If you stay at the same company and do the same job, people oftentimes are not emotionally ready to get paid less for the actual same job. I don't think we're wired that way. So that's a very tough conversation to have. And finally, no one wants to feel like a second-class citizen or employee. That's a very tricky situation to be in as an employee. So all of that brings me to say that, of course, we can talk about salary calculator and spreadsheets and formulas, but it's not what it is. This is a C-level, that's the founders, this is the people ops, this is a culture conversation about what kind of company do we want to be and how do we want to pay our people. So again, let's do that compensation policies at a few different companies. Let's start with Basecamp. You may be familiar with Basecamp. They just launched the email platform hey.com, and they run the famous website basecamp.com. They're famous because they do extremely well in the sense that they do great things for their employees. The minimum pay at their company is $70,000, and they pay top 10% salaries of San Francisco market wherever you are. If you are in Cape Town, South Africa, you still get the best wage you would get as a engineer or software developer or any profession you have working SF. So that's extremely generous. And a lot of people say, look at Basecamp, they do great. Why don't you do the same? Well, it's great to get context before you give advice. Basecamp happens to have 56 employees, and according to my humble calculation, because we're all good friends of the SaaS business over here, their SaaS is bringing over $100 million per year. So that was back when I did the cruncher number a year ago. So unless your business is bringing $2 million per year per employee, I'd really consider the conversation of putting a blanket salaries on a top San Francisco market. Besides, especially in time of uncertainty or crisis, especially at a VC-led event, it'd be an interesting conversation to be paying everyone top salaries, top market. If you can, that's great. What I'm saying is this is the exception, not the rule. When in doubt, assume you're not in Basecamp financial situation. If you are, that's great for you. But most people, not really. Other companies, they took a different stance. They want to think about fairness and they want to think about equality. So here's a little picture I really, really like. When you use a formula, when you use a philosophy to set your compensation as a distributed team, oftentimes it's because you recognize that equal is not always the same thing as fair. Equal is paying everyone the same. Fair is adapting what you get so that people get to live a good life wherever they are. And that can be quite different. I really like this little picture, and that's a stance that some other companies have been taking. Of course, Buffer, the company where I worked, did that through a funny spreadsheet and through basically experience levels, location, company size, and tenure at the company. Since they introduced a formula in 2013, my understanding is that they changed it pretty much every single year ever since, with a grandfathering situation where when the salary formula would change, you will be grandfathered into your last salary so that people would not have really big hardship into projecting themselves, especially if they had a family, especially if they had obligations to meet, of course. I'm here in the last row, so that's probably a screenshot from 2014, I believe. Good. So Buffer took a compensation approach that's based on a spreadsheet. GitLab did the same thing. And after this session, you're going to have a talk with Ruth. I hope I say that correctly, from GitLab. So I'm not going to speak about it too much. But if you're in search of a great compensation framework, as far as I know, by the end of 2020, the company that has been mastering this is GitLab. Why? Because they do not only give the rationales they're using, but they also give most of the data. So it's very interesting to follow along, understand their reasoning, and seeing whether it resonates with you and your team, especially because they put a lot of thoughts in perks and also in fairly granular factors that most earlier team would not see. I'm not saying, again, that you should replicate it, copy and paste. It's just a great reference point for you to look at, okay? HelpScout did a formula approach as well, but they did it slightly differently. They decided to take a cultural stance. They said, yes, remote employees should not be paid less based on geography, but it's also a SaaS company with a balance sheet, a CFO, and leadership that's looking at the top line. So they said, we're going to pay top 10 or 25% market, but we align on second tier markets, such as for the US, Boston, New York, or Seattle, San Francisco, Bay Area being a market. So that's very interesting because all of a sudden, even if you have a talent acquisition policy, if you're transparent about the salary you're going to be offering, headhunting and recruiting and what you're going to be able to offer or state upfront in your job description is going to be very different. And the importance here, my friend, is what you see is what you get. It's not so much about having the most generous policies of all time. It's about having something comprehensive that employees and applicants can wrap their head around. So those are the first two examples. We've been through San Francisco salaries for everyone and formula-led salaries. Now comes the third one, and things are getting interesting because we got Facebook showing up and VMware and many other large tech companies that traditionally used to be within premises, and then COVID hits, they had to go remote, and then magic happened. So let's check out what our good friend Mark Zuckerberg said about the situation. He said about Facebook, we are going to be the most forward-leaning company on remote work at our scale. And we're going to do this over time in a way that is measured, thoughtful, and responsible. So when Mr. Zuckerberg said that, most people assume that Facebook will make good on the employee by being more flexible and offering more, I'll say, affording them more freedom. But what happened was a little bit different because reality kicked in and shareholder reality kicked in as well. And what was said shortly thereafter was staff salaries could be adjusted to align with the cost of living in the chosen location of employees. So there's been a declaration of intention towards remote work, and then a little bit of a backing off due to financial constraints. But that's not so surprising, though, because it's been how big tech has been handling salaries from the beginning. They align salaries on location. And there's been a lot of controversy on this. You can find Medium posts with like 11,000 claps saying Facebook new remote salary is barbaric, written by someone who's sells remote work things. So there's vested interest in making Facebook look bad. But the reality of the matter is expectations were mismanaged. And I wanted to share that example because that's one of the most tricky things that can happen in setting a compensation policy is mismanaging expectation of people being promised one thing and realizing something else is happening. Facebook is not alone in this. A lot of other people like VMware and other big companies, Twitter is looking into this, is doing about the same thing. They said, if you're in San Francisco, you get paid X. If you want to move away, you get paid Y. And we're going to reshuffle that. There's been some tolerance for 2020, but coming 21, there's going to be a big discussion. And in brackets, we don't know for sure what's going to happen for equity, because if you got granted a lot of stock as a very high level in San Francisco, can you take that money and go to Wisconsin? That's still a question mark. So we're sort of waiting to see how that plays out. Now, there are notable exceptions, my friend, with a few companies doing slightly different things, which has been catching my attention because I like when people innovate and do different things. Check out Stripe, for instance. Stripe has been forward-looking remote work, and they said this: if you want to relocate, you can get a 20,000 bonus and you'll have a pay cut. But your pay cut will be as much as 10%. So what do we have here? Stripe is saying, yes, of course you're going to get paid less if you move somewhere else, but you're going to get quite a bit of cash to sort yourself out, and you're going to get as much as 10%, arguably not more. And besides, it's great PR because you get the bonus and the pay cut thing kind of working together. And the last thing about this is that Stripe had a very big involvement in the distributed field by opening what they call the 5th engineering hub that has been entirely remote, and this was pre-COVID. So they had a very strong commitment towards remote work. They thought it through, and they could come up with a strategy that was managing expectation because very likely they had those questions coming in, so they had to manage it internally. Now let's move to another company, much smaller and entirely distributed, which is another case of Facebook, Stripe, and others. Zapier did something very interesting. Zapier went as far as to say, we're going to pay you up to $10,000 if you want to leave the San Francisco Bay Area and to go anywhere else. Because what they said is, we're not going to pay top dollar, but if you want to move out, we'll help with your moving fees or whatever. This is great PR. Did a lot of people take them up on it? I'm not sure. But that's sending a very strong signal to applicants saying, we are prioritizing talent coming from everywhere rather than being San Francisco-centric, where our mailbox is and where our investors are sitting right now. So that's an interesting take. Now, I know I'm really going fast through this, but I have a few additional thoughts, and then we'll have a few questions and answers if we can. Okay, so let's think about employees when you do global compensation for a minute. A very important learning I had through the years working at Buffer, which is a very transparent company internally and externally, is that employees don't always expect transparency. They expect clarity. They want you to be able to answer what your thinking process is. It's not about knowing how much every single employee is making publicly. It's about understanding how you do things. Instead of having an opaque smoke mirror, you actually have a policy in place. And of course, second bullet point, yes, employees know how much other employees are making. If you bring them together at an offsite after 2 beverages of their choice and a couple of days, they will know how much the other is making. So if you're paying people differently, the word is going to get out. It's not a if, it's a when, really. Besides, legacy situations matter a lot. I know it's very nice to see me here talking about compensation policies, but every single person watching this already has employees, is already running payroll, and already made commitment toward their existing team. So I know it's tough because maybe you had deals that's going to be tough to continue upholding with other people. But I'd really urge you to avoid making second-class citizen as in hired guns if you want to have full-time team members. If you want to have a coherent distributed team with everybody feeling like they belong as a full-time team member, not only as a contractor, you really have to bring a lot of clarity about how you're rewarding your people, I think. Besides on policies, and that's almost one of my last slides, you gotta be able to do whatever you like with compensation, because I've seen people being fine with compensation that are geo-arbitrage or top salaries. you will find a market and you will be able to find talent, whatever your policy is, to be very honest. But you've got to be able to explain why you chose it and why it makes sense for you. Besides, unifying perks globally is hard, but it's not impossible. It used to be much harder a few years ago. Today, thanks to Yelp, that's going to tell you about international employment, for instance, it's much easier to offer someone a situation that's different. You'll see a lot of people that want to work for you full-time, and they'd be happier making 10% less if they can actually go to the bank, be a full-time local employee where they live, and have a mortgage under the name because they're contracted by your company. I'm not saying that to negotiate down. I'm saying that because compensation is a package, and package is not only the dollar amount you're wiring to someone, but the entire perks, benefit, and status you're offering them as well. Equity is a very complex topic, but with ISO and NSO, if you have a US entity, that is something that can be worked out as well. I've been issuing equity internationally through Carta.com at Buffer, and we did manage to do that. Profit sharing is also a great way to do that if you want to include it in your compensation policies. Besides, with Yelp, you're going to be able to answer the question, am I better off having contractors? I'm just going to wire you money to TransferWise, or full-time employee through a legal entity. And finally, I know we're in the HR track today, but pay and company culture are very much intertwined. I do feel like founders should get involved, and I do think it's a company-wide discussion, at least a C-level-wide discussion to decide how you want to pay people. And besides, P9 certainly has great pointers and an opinion on the topic. If you want to go further and read more on this topic of international employment, Yelp's going to have tons of answers. I also wrote a blog post called How to Employ and Pay Remote Employees Around the World. It's a long one, but I feel it's a pretty good resource to go further. Finally, we're going to go to Q&A. Again, if you want to hire remotely, just like many other P9 family company, you can go and hit me up. I'll tell you all about Remotive. I hang out on the Slack from the P9 community, and I'm very happy to take any question you have. That's it for me today.
Thanks a lot, Rodolphe. This was awesome, and a pretty great overview of a lot of the best practices or not so great practices that a lot of the biggest companies in the world are applying in the world of today. I guess we're bringing onto stage in a sec some of the folks that have questions, but I also have a question, so I'll ask mine first. What's your view? Like, Europe is a pretty fragmented space. A lot of the examples that you provided were very sort of US centric that are now kind of escaping the Bay Area into the rest of the US, and then unlocking the rest of the world as well for talent. But I'd love to get your view for, like, you know, European companies that ultimately end up hiring across countries here in Europe with, you know, to a certain extent, different taxation systems, different ESOP systems, different benefit systems. And, you know, like, I think the war on, like, let's say, I hate the word war, but I'll just use it now. The war on talent is getting very fierce. And to a certain extent, you need to start looking early on outside of the city where you're building your business. And it becomes harder and harder, especially in the world of today, to convince folks to move to London, Paris, and or probably not Lisbon, where I am. But I'd love to get your view on this, and how do companies should think about this early on.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a different world, to be honest. I'm sitting here in Paris, France, and we're going in national lockdown in about 2.5 hours, and we'll be locked for at least a month. So talent migration and where people want to live, how they have freedom, how they can enjoy their time with family, or just how they commute to do business, all of that has changed. And I believe that someone that's been outside of a city for a while may decide that it's a different life is possible altogether. Remote works used to be fringe, now it's going mainstream. So I think hybrid is a bare minimum that most of the startup are going to see, which means a few people at HQ and others distributed around Europe or elsewhere. And going all the way, meaning being fully distributed, is not that fringe or niche anymore. We're starting to see billion-dollar businesses are saying, like Dropbox with 3,000 people. We're virtual first now. So to come back to your question on the talent front, it is super important for you to recognize that there are very, very talented and awesome and passionate people outside of main hubs, outside of cities, and connecting with them often offers, great, pleasant experience, but also from an HR standpoint, like you often have awesome talent retention. You also have people that are very, very passionate, because if you're looking for another, senior backend developer in Paris and you work in fintech and you want 50 of them tomorrow, well, guess what? There are not enough of them in Paris because they're already well paid and then they're going to move. So we're going to have to zoom out, look elsewhere. And if English is the language you use to work for work, then it's great. I'm not a native speaker, but I get by. A lot of people are doing the same. So I think we're headed towards more flexibility. And even as a small team, it's very feasible to be distributed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. Oana, can we invite Jessica Hayes? She's posted 2 questions into the... Jessica, if you see the invite from Oana, feel free to accept it. So, okay. 3, 2, 1. I guess you had 2 questions, right, Jessica?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first one is, how can you use some other elements of compensation that are maybe more creative if you're kind of cash poor, cash strapped? And the second one, which I think is an interesting question, is I've often heard the kind of golden handcuffs argument around overpaying in emerging markets, kind of getting someone feeling trapped to a job because it pays £10,000 a year more than, say, $15,000 a year role in India. What do you think about that argument? Do you think it holds weight? Yeah, that's my 2 questions.
Those are great. So the first one about benefits when you're cash poor, I feel like it depends on the culture of the team, but one of the things that I've seen and I love best was unlimited Kindle books for the entire team back at Buffer. I really enjoy that. Buying Kindles, probably $49. Unlimited Kindle book for a team of 80 people set us back a couple of thousand a year. And you really feel like you had freedom to read anything you wanted. And since one of the values was around learning and sharing, it made a lot of sense to enable people to just that, enabling people to do sports or to take the significant other on a night out or just, especially or order in those troubled times is another thing that I've seen work well. And other than that, I think that on-premise startup, especially VC-backed one, are pretty interested about learning development when it's on face-to-face, but sometimes it doesn't go all the way when it's virtual. Having credit on Coursera or Teachable or any online platform you like sometimes goes a long way towards someone professional development, even though it's cooking classes or something very, very different. So without going crazy about giving profit sharing to the entire company or setting up 401k globally, I think that many small benefits can be achieved for a couple of thousand a year. That does have impact on morale overall. So that's the first part. The second part is very interesting about golden handcuffs. Yes, if you work in support and you make $50,000 to $70,000 to $80,000, and the next best available job locally is half or a third of that, it becomes a real question to say, are you just in a cushy job or are you enjoying this professionally? I've been debating that a lot because as your company grows, you want to do good by your people, so salaries tend to rise. But I'm actually aware that golden handcuff exists, and it often leads to fairly frequent, like quarterly or biannual people ops updates, just to see how the person really feels and to see whether they can move in the company within the company and do something else, or how that feels for them. Because time and time again, surprisingly, I've seen people adapt a lot of their standard of living to remote salaries, and when there's an order of magnitude between the salary you hold and the one you will have if you're outside of the company, it is tricky. So I don't have a fully fledged answer other than monitoring and conversation. That's all I came up with.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks everyone. I think we're done with the session with Rodolphe. You can catch him on the .9 Family Slack's remote channel, and hopefully we can catch you as well in the networking sessions after the final 2 sessions that you'll have to pick one of them to attend. They're both great. Job, ex-GitLab, now remote.com, and who's currently a people partner at GitLab. We're finishing this session now. Rudolf, thanks so much for taking part in our virtual summit and for your contribution to it. Everyone else, I'll see you in the next session. You'll have to go that way. Thank you.